joins. Welcome everyone to this year's Southwest Marine Ecosystems Marine and Coastal Bird presentation. I'm joined today by four other speakers: Hester Odgers, Scott Reed, Mark Grantham and Joe Parker. And we're going to tell you about what's been happening with marine and coastal birds in the Southwest in 2024. I'd like to start by saying a big thanks to today's speakers and also the other people listed on the slide. Everyone's given their time freely to put this presentation together, so we hope you find it interesting. We're going to start in the Isles of Scilly with Hester, and then we're going to stay in that part of the world to hear from Scott about some of the observations from the pelagics. We'll then go to Mark for an update on Cornwall, then up to Lundy for Joe to give us an update from there. And we'll finish with me talking about what's been happening in Devon and Dorset on behalf of Chris Goding from RSPB. So I will hand over to Hester. Hester is Seabird Officer for Isles of Scilly Wildlife Trust, and Hester's going to kick us off with telling us about the update from the Isles of Scilly seabird monitoring in 2024. Thanks, Hester.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for that, Alex. Last year was our first year returning to our sort of regular annual monitoring schedule. In 2023, we did our big all species, all islands special protection area count, which is sort of a full census of all the breeding seabirds on Scilly. Obviously, we can't do that every year for sort of cost and logistics reasons. It's a huge effort. So this year has been a return to monitoring productivity and abundance at particular sites for particular species. So I'll just sort of walk you through some of the significant stuff that's been happening on Scilly this last summer. Next slide, please. Yeah, so one thing that's happened was Scilly, along with the Flamborough and Filey coast, was identified as being sort of the standard of a key site for the seabird monitoring program, which is quite exciting, along with the sort of sites listed up top there in Scotland and Wales. And that's mainly because of our location, which is out in the Celtic Sea. So we're getting sort of information on birds in that geographical area because we have quite a significant assemblage of bird species, both in terms of nationally and regionally important abundances of some species and quite a wide diversity of different bird species breeding on Scilly. And because we have quite a solid record of monitoring the bird species, there's been some sort of monitoring of the birds on Scilly, seabirds on Scilly since 1969. And we've sort of been collecting increasing amounts of data in the sort of semi-regular all-island counts and then increasing amounts of annual monitoring since then. So we've got quite a useful long data set. Yeah, next slide, please. So that comes with sort of motivation to try and improve our amount of integrated monitoring. So we were particularly trying to increase the amount of abundance and productivity data we were collecting. And we're also trying to move into monitoring some survival and diet and phenology in our seabirds. That's proved quite challenging so far. So it's mostly something we're hoping to move into more in the future. Next slide, please. So this is just the Isles of Scilly in 2023. This is the abundance of the breeding pairs of seabirds, just to give you an idea of how widely distributed they are across the archipelago. Obviously, as I said, we can't monitor all of these every year, so we sort of choose particular sites. And the main sites I'm going to talk about are Annet, which is down the sort of biggest red dot down in the southwest corner. And then next to that, the big islands, St Agnes and Gew, we monitor every year. We then monitor two sides up north, which are Round Island and St Helens for particular species, mainly for tube noses. And then there's a couple of other scattered bits of productivity data we collect across the archipelago. So starting with Annet, next slide. Yeah, Annet is a really significant island. It's our biggest no-access island, so you're only allowed on with special permission. It's also our biggest rat-free island outside of St Agnes and Gew. And it's got a really good diversity of habitats. So it is our most significant seabird colony, both in terms of diversity of species and the abundance of lots of those species. So some highlights from last summer on Annet are the Great Black Gull colony. Well, highlights may be the wrong word because obviously it's not doing very well. As you can see, it's down at a bit of a low last summer. this is our most significant great black-backed gull colony on the archipelago, so it is a bit concerning that it continues to decline. And that is reflective of a wider decline across the archipelago. So they're down about 38% between 2015 and 2023. So we do think what's happening on Annet is quite representative, and we're not sure why. So we'll continue to monitor what's happening in that colony. Also interesting was the shag population on Annet. So we have the biggest breeding shag population in England, and Annet is the biggest shag population on Scilly, one of the biggest shag populations on Scilly. So it's a relief to see that it's bounced back a little bit from a real low in 2023. Obviously, it's still not particularly high. It's lower than it was in 2019 and 2021. But it's good to see that it's bounced back slightly. I'll talk a little bit more about the difficulties of monitoring shags on Scilly later, but we can't monitor them in the way that some other sites can. Our shags tend to nest tucked in under boulders and in caves, and they're very flighty, so they tend to leave the nest the moment you get anywhere near them. So it's quite hard to monitor them on a wider scale than just Annet, and you do cause quite a lot of disturbance when you're walking around counting them. So those were the sort of headlines from Annet. Onto the Northern Islands, so St. Helens and Round Island. The story here is mostly about rats. So Round Island is historically rat-free. St. Helens next to it has historically always had a big population of rats. St. Helens has a population of around about 100 Manx shearwaters nesting on it, despite the really high rat populations. So we're assuming they're probably having quite low breeding success, but they keep trying every year. So in the winter of 2023-24, we carried out the St. Helens Recovery Project, during which we were trialing a new form of rat poison, and we were attempting to see if that was an effective way to clear the island of rats, to A, to safeguard nearby Round Island, and B, to give those Manxies a bit of a respite. We put a lot of effort into trying to clear the island. We, in the end, didn't quite manage to clear all the rats. We had about 5 individuals left, which have then since rocketed back up. The population's back up very high. And the playback survey of Manxies this summer found a reasonably consistent population, probably, unfortunately, still continuing to not be very successful at breeding. Neighbouring Round Island has generally got quite a big storm petrel population, as well as Manx shearwaters, and we monitor them every summer. In 2023, we had about 105 apparently occupied nest sites for storm petrels on Round Island. But then at some point between the survey for storm petrels in July in 2023 and a biosecurity check in December 2023, rats got back to the island. We found a rat sign. And that might go some way to explaining why we only had 17 apparently occupied nests last summer. So it's a massive drop. And we think maybe if the rats found their way back there towards the end of the breeding season, that might explain that. We have subsequently cleared the rats again, so it will be interesting to see what is happening with them this summer, because we found storm petrels can be very, very reactive, so they can re-establish populations and also decline massively very quickly, depending on whether or not there's rat presence on the island. St. Agnes and Gew is a massive part around our annual monitoring. So it's been now just over 10 years since the Seabird Recovery Project, which was for anyone who doesn't know, successful clearing of all rats across St. Agnes and Gew. And we've basically surveyed all species except for storm petrels across both islands every year since just before that project began. So it's been really interesting to see what's happened to, especially the Manx shearwaters. Storm petrels, we just do a little sample area because it's not really feasible to cover the whole area for storm petrels every year. On Gew, we have our lesser blackback gulls have their biggest remaining colony. So across Scilly, lesser blackback gulls have sort of collapsed a bit. They're down nearly 60% from 2015. And there were historically sort of 3 big colonies, and now the ones on Gew are the only ones remaining. So it's encouraging to see they're reasonably stable at around 400, just over 400 pairs. But we're going to have to continue monitoring them pretty closely because we really don't want that last population to collapse. Also across St. Agnes and Gew, we do a full survey of all the Manxie numbers. So you can see there the big increase in Manx shearwater numbers from 2013, 2014, which is when the rats were cleared. It's been a fairly consistent increase. the graph does show a massive drop well, not a massive drop, quite a significant drop in 2024. I do just want to sort of tag that with the information that for any of you who don't know, when you're surveying Manx shearwaters, you have to get an average response rate for the colony. So you do a sort of repeated playback survey of a set number of burrows to try and get the average number of birds that will respond to you, which gives you a response rate, which then gives you a calibration factor. So you multiply the number of actual responses you get across the island by that calibration factor. And the calibration factor in 2023 was really unusually high. We had a very low response rate in our sample survey. So we think that the 2024 calibration number was a lot lower. So that big drop is maybe more reflective of the change in the response rate in that sample site than in the actual population. We actually got more responses last year than we did in 2023, but the correction factor being that much lower means it looks like we've had quite a big drop off. So I think we're not really worried about that apparent drop just yet. We're going to see what happens this summer. Yeah, but it is a shame that we've slightly ruined that nice upward trend we had on the graph. But hey ho. And then we've also got a small population of storm petrels on Burnt Island, just off St Agnes, which seems to be remaining quite consistent and doing quite well. So alongside our abundance monitoring, we also study. This is just a quick map of where the Manx shearwater burrows are across the two islands. And obviously they're slightly expanding in their range, which is really encouraging. So as well as all the abundance monitoring, we study the productivity of certain species every year on Scilly. So one of those species is the fulmar. We look at two subcolonies, which are on Menawethan and below the Daymark on St Martin's. And obviously they are not doing very well. Menawethan seems to be at a bit of a historic low, and the Daymark's not doing very much better. We've studied them annually since 2006, and there's been some real ups and downs, but there's been a bit of a consistent downward trend for the last few years. And that is reflective of a wider decline across the archipelago. So they are down about 16% since 2015. Not sure why, but they do seem to be on a bit of a downwards trend. We also monitor the productivity of kittiwakes on Gew. So historically, there would have been several colonies of kittiwakes across the Isles of Scilly. We now just have one very small subcolony. It's this one. It's nothing like the big towering kittiwake cliffs you get on some of the Scottish colonies. It's this very small bit of ram just on one corner of Gew. And we have about 22 pairs of kittiwakes most years. The good news is they did actually manage to successfully breed last year. They didn't in 2023, but they got away about 14 fledglings last summer. That is still below what's needed to really sustain the colony, but it is better than the 0 they had in 2023. In 2023, we had trail cameras up, and we basically had a series of photos of a pair of crows just coming in and taking egg after egg, and then finally a peregrine falcon came in and landed on the nest. So the poor kittiwakes there wasn't really much they could do about it. But nice to see they had some success last summer, and hopefully they'll continue that this summer. Herring gulls are declining across the archipelago in their natural environments, but they seem to be reasonably consistent in Hughtown. So there's about 20 pairs that consistently breed in Hughtown, and Vicky and I monitor their productivity to see what's going on with them. They're a little bit down this year, not so much that we're really concerned. It's probably the limiting factor on these gulls is probably the habitat. There's a little bit of prosecution. Gulls are a little controversial, especially to B&B owners who've got a pair of gulls screaming outside tourist windows. But we think it's probably a limitation. The limiting factor is probably the amount of habitat. Also, a new thing we were doing last summer was we were trying to increase the amount of camera monitoring we were using across Scilly. It was a bit of a pilot year because we had a few teething problems, but we were looking into how to use cameras more effectively across several of our seabird populations to collect more data. So we had trail cameras up on Gew to try and see what was happening with the lesser blackback gulls there. As you can see from the photos, our setup wasn't really right. It was too low of an angle. All we got was some nice sort of atmospheric evening light shots and that nice selfie of a gull sticking its face into the frame. which you know, I enjoy, but were not particularly valuable data-wise. So this summer we are aiming to have them on a bit of a higher rig and hopefully be looking down on the nests more, which should enable us to do more analysis on them. We also had cameras up on, oh, sorry. Yes, I was going to mention the lesser blackback gull productivity. So we measure the productivity of the lesser blackbacks on GEW. The reason it's this last summer's result is in sort of a lighter shade is we're not super confident with that result. We think there might have been a bit of an issue with the drone image analysis. It might have been done a little bit late in the season. So before we start panicking about that low productivity number, we're going to see what happens this summer, change up our methodology a little bit. But yeah, it's sort of to be seen if that's actually reflective of a bigger decline. We also had cameras up on some of our shag nests just to see if it was an effective way of monitoring their productivity. As I said, our shags, there's also a slight error on this slide. It should be St. Helens and Annet. We had cameras up on our shag nests. As I mentioned earlier, our shags are quite hard to get a good view at. So if you want to have any photos of a shag nest, you need a trail camera for every nest. And it's also quite hard to get good images because any of you who know shags will know that if you put anything near their nest at ground level, they'll shit all over it. So in order to not have your camera covered, you need it at a really high angle. And then if your shag nest is under a boulder or in a cave, it can get quite hard to capture good images. But we found it does work to some extent. It's quite labor intensive. So hopefully we can roll that out a bit more over the next few years, see if we can actually get the number of nests monitored up to something that is valuable. We also had these massive great camera rigs out on Annet. Just for context, that's about 200 kilograms worth of scaffolding that we had to land on a very, very windy, wet day in March over last winter. Sorry, winter before last. And then we had to trek 200 kilograms of scaffolding across the full length of Annet. So it was exhausting. It was a very labor-intensive process. But we wanted to get these big rigs up to monitor our great blackbacks. We did install the cameras. Unfortunately, there was a technical issue with one of them, so it didn't end up sending images. And the other one, we found that the terrain is not great for them. So the great blackbacks nest in sort of quite apparently flat areas, but they tend to tuck themselves in behind clumps of thrift, which means it's very hard to get more than 1 or 2 nests in the camera view at any one time, which is not really effective. So yeah, we've actually moved those cameras to look at a fulmar colony. And we're hoping the technical issues can be resolved in time to maybe get some good images of what's going on with our fulmars maybe next summer. Yeah, looking ahead to 2025, we're trying to adjust our camera usage a little bit. So the kittiwake cameras went out a couple of weeks ago. Lesser blackbacks I'm hoping to get out really soon, as soon as our new rigs arrive. Shags, we'd like to collect more productivity data on them to try and monitor them a bit more closely. We've moved the cameras to the fulmars. We've also got quite a lot of exciting partnership work happening this summer. So we've got some visiting scientists over who are going to be looking into tracking our storm petrels and our Manx shearwaters on foraging trips. So that's really exciting. We've got the University of Exeter has a PhD student over who's tracking a number of our seabird species and trying to match up their distributions with forage fish distributions and shipping distribution to see if that's having any effect. We're continuing on with our ringing and colour ringing schemes of various species. We're moving into collecting proper nest record cards for some of our beach nesting birds, which I haven't really mentioned, but they are significant parts of our bird assemblage. So we're going to try and up our recording of what's happening with them. And we're also really looking for ways to improve our auk monitoring techniques. Similar to shags, our guillemots especially tend to nest in and amongst boulders, and it's very, very hard to get decent data on our populations, and we'd really like to. So if anyone has any tips for collecting better data on boulder nesting auk colonies without being massively disturbing to them, please do get in touch.
Thank you, Hester. That was great. Bit of a mixed bag by the sound of it last year. I don't know if there are any questions, Maya. I can't actually see the chat at the moment, but are there any questions for Hester from the chat, or does anybody on the call want to ask Hester a question?
Not at the moment. There's none in the chat space.
Okay, I had a quick one then. Take chair's prerogative. Hester, if you can get the cameras working, will there be opportunities for people to do anything with those images? Because I know sometimes they're shared on citizen science pages for people to help analysis. Is that part of your plans or not?
Yes, oh, sorry, I should have probably mentioned. We've been sending them to Tom Hart's Zooniverse Citizen Science Project at Oxford Brookes for analysis. So he's been advising on how best to get the kind of images they need.
Okay, so yeah, so there might well be images that people can go in, look at, and help, tag chicks in images and things like that, if it all goes according to plan.
Yes, if we can get the camera set up to work properly.
The birds would comply. Okay,
Yes.
thanks. I can see Mark's got his hand up as well. So, Mark.
Yeah, mine was just a comment really that which was relevant to Scilly because I wasn't mentioning it in my Cornwall bit. Was the really grim spring weather that we had that shags that I was monitoring in Cornwall, we probably lost half of our early nesting attempts to spring storms. And the relevance to Scilly, I think, is when we were colouring shags on Annet. It was quite obvious that as we went up the exposed western side of the island, then there were lots of shags of a ringable size. But then when we came back down the sheltered eastern side of the island, a lot of the nesting attempts had already finished, and they were just empty nests that we're pretty sure probably had chicks fledged from them. And I think that big difference was that those exposed nests on the western side were washed out again in those same spring storms, and they were 2-3 weeks later than on the eastern side, just because they were relays.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. That's really interesting. I think it might be good if we collect our Annet data does have sort of specific locations on Annet recorded. So maybe it would be good for us to start processing the data so it shows the distribution of the birds across Annet. That'd be an interesting thing to look at.
Thanks, Hester.
There are a couple of questions, Alex, as well. There's one from Justin here who's asking what the new rodenticide is that you're trialing, and is it a SGAR?
No, so this was back in winter 2023-24. We sort of finished the trial. It was a cholecalciferol, so it wasn't an anticoagulant.
And there's another question which is about recreational activities like paddleboarding or wildlife watching boat trips, and whether they've had any impact on bird colonies in the Isles of Scilly.
It's always a little hard to say. We think they probably have quite a big impact on our ring plovers. So we've got my colleague is focusing a project on monitoring the effects of recreational disturbance on ring plovers this summer. Gulls are probably the next most vulnerable. So we're trying to increase our signage a little bit, asking people to be really careful of dogs. We think dogs are probably one of the main risks. People letting their dogs off leads because Scilly is a big, dog holiday location. But Gew is quite a heavily frequented area, and the lesser blackbacks seem to be doing okay there. So it's obviously not the end of the world if there's a little bit of disturbance. Beyond that, it's a bit hard to tell, just because of the sort of various amounts of disturbance you get across the islands. But obviously the fact that Annet is no access and is our biggest seabird colony does suggest it has some impact.
And there's just one more here from Pete asking, would predator control of the corvids be considered if the kittiwake colony continues to suffer from predation in future years?
Well, they didn't seem to suffer from it at all last year. And I think it's something we'd be quite reluctant to go into. We haven't really talked about it, just because it seemed to be a one-off last year. I guess it's a discussion we could have if it continued year on year, but I don't think it's something we'd be we'd be keen to go into. It's not necessarily a road we'd be wanting to go down if we can avoid it.
Yeah, thanks, Hester. I can see Justin has his hand up. Have you got another question, Justin, or is it the same one?
Yeah, hi Esther. I just wondered if you knew what stages the formers were failing at. Was it predominantly the egg stage or the chick stage, or you don't know?
Don't know, I'm afraid. We monitor them from boats, so it's sort of binoculars and spotting just fulmar heads sticking out of thrift clumps, and then we come back and monitor for, chicks that are ready to fledge at the end of the season. So that's partly why we really want to get those big cameras out looking at the fulmars on Annet, so we have more information. But at the moment, the only thing we can really do is get this very broad for some reason there aren't as many chicks as we would like there to be at the end of the season.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Hester. We'll move on now to the next speaker. So people who have joined these Southwest Marine Ecosystem calls in the past would have heard Mark in particular talking about numbers of seabirds coming into UK waters that tend to breed outside of the UK from around the headlands. But I'm delighted today to say we've got Scott Reed joining us to talk to us about what's been happening out on the pelagics. So Scott is a seabird researcher based on the Isles of Scilly, and he specialises in pelagic birding and studying seabirds at sea. So over to you, Scott, to tell us about increasing numbers of quote unquote rare seabirds in the southwest approaches.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I've put the rare in quotation marks there because, as we'll discuss in a minute, quite a few of these seabirds were previously considered to be very rare megas, if you like, in British waters, are becoming more and more frequent in the last couple of years. And we're going to have a look, see if we can figure out the reasons why. So we can move on to the first slide. So just a bit of background, Scilly pelagics is, for those of you that aren't familiar with pelagics, a pelagic boat trip is something that goes, a trip that goes out to sea. So rather than round coastal areas, it's focusing on birds out in deeper waters. So Scilly pelagics has been running now for 25 years. And it was established by Bob Flood, who is a world-renowned seabird researcher based here on Scilly, alongside the skipper of the Sapphire and also sort of world-renowned seabird photographer, Joe Pender. So since the year 2000, when they first started doing these trips together, they head out on maybe on average 50 pelagics per year, often in the earlier part of the season, May, June, they go out in the evenings. And then as they get into August, the trips become more regular and they run daytime runs as well, lasting normally 5 to 7 hours per pelagic. So even though the data that is gathered from these pelagics isn't particularly scientific, especially compared to some of the stuff that Hester was just discussing, it's observational data, and it just allows over long periods of time. I mean, we're looking at 25 years worth of trips. It allows to build up patterns and build up pictures of what's going on out there, even if it's not following a particular sort of scientific method. So the data that I'm going to use or have used to create these slides today is mostly from pelagics, but there is some data from also headland sea watches off Scilly and from observations from the Selonian ferry crossings, which often plug some gaps a little bit in when pelagics aren't running. So the three species I'm initially going to talk about that we've seen a significant shift in terms of population of passage birds off Scilly are the Corey shearwater, the Great Shearwater, and Wilson storm petrel. Now, these aren't breeding birds around Scilly. They are passage migrants. They are annual passage migrants. We see them in varying numbers every year and have done for as long as these trips have been going out into our waters. But we've seen a massive shift in recent years in the numbers of these birds off Scilly. And then associated with those big increases in numbers of these passage migrants, we've seen what were previously incredibly rare birds in British waters take an upwards increase in terms of number of records, and those are Scopoli shearwater, South Polar skua, and red-footed and brown booby to a lesser extent, but still there's still quite a notable increase in occurrences there. So we'll go have a look at those a little later on and look at their breeding ranges and why we think they might be heading up this way. So Corey shearwater to begin with, this is a breeding species in the North Atlantic. This species breeds around Micronesia, Canaries, down to across to the Azores, and all around those sort of East Atlantic islands there. Big populations on their breeding grounds, and a species that it is a regular passage migrant through British waters in the summer months, usually around peaking in sort of late July going through August, but normally by September, classically, we stop seeing these birds in any great numbers. So let's have a look at the history of these birds. Now, from 2000 onwards up to 2017, they would come through annually, but in relatively low numbers. There was a couple of peak years where, as you can see there, 700 went past in 1 year, but normally in sort of day counts of less than 20 individuals. And some years were very, very low. I mean, 2010 there, only 2 birds were recorded in the whole summer. So this is from pelagics and from headlands. So a very mixed bag. And what we would see with this species is when they did come through British waters or Selonian waters, when they did come through in larger numbers, say 100, 200 birds, they would move out very quickly. So they were passing through, often driven by wind, southwesterly winds pushing them into our waters, and then they'd move out again quite quickly. So these little arrivals of them would last 2 or 3 days, and then they would move out. But then from 2017, we saw a real step change. Now, this will be the same as we go on to talk about the Great Shearwaters and Wilson Storm Petrels in a couple of minutes. We saw this big shift, this big difference in the numbers of Corey shearwaters arriving in our waters. And it was a record year at that point. It was a record year of over 2,000 birds were recorded in Selonian waters from the pelagics in the summer of 2017, with a peak day count of 1,200 birds. So this was unprecedented at the time. Now, one of the main changes that we saw in that summer was the return of Atlantic bluefin tuna into Selonian waters, and these tuna were feeding on bait fish, which we believe were anchovies, and it was creating these big feeding frenzies, and the shearwaters were associating with these feeding frenzies. And what we noticed was, instead of these birds just passing through and moving out of our waters quite quickly, they were staying to feed, because the food availability was higher, which we believed to some extent was caused by the presence of the tuna and the presence of these smaller bait fish. There was a bit of a drop off for a couple of years. 2018 saw again a little increase, or at slightly less numbers, but again higher than we'd previously seen of Corys passing through. And then in 2023, there was an incredible event. It was a mega influx of Corey shearwaters, like nothing we could have ever predicted we were going to see with this species. And over the course of that summer period, we're looking at tens and tens of thousands of birds. We had 10,000 birds recorded in 1 day. And what we also noticed with the species was that they stayed in Selonian waters deep into October, which was unprecedented. Again, normally we're losing them in our waters by the end of August, but massive numbers stayed into October. And then again, going into last year, 2024, we were interested to see whether that was going to be a one-off event in 2023 with the numbers of Corys that we saw. But slight drop off again in numbers, but still massive arrival, big influx compared to typically at least before 2017. And we had a peak day count in 2024 of 2,500 birds, with an estimated total of 15,000 around Selonian waters through that summer period, staying this time even later into November, and again associating with tuna feeding frenzies. So again, a real big shift locally in our waters with Corey shearwaters the last couple of years. And again, like with Corys, Great Shearwater is a passage migrant through our waters and through the North Atlantic as a whole. Now, these aren't North Atlantic breeders; these are Southern Hemisphere breeders. So Great Shearwaters breed on only a few islands in the South Atlantic, but they're with big populations within the Tristan da Cunha group and down in Falklands. So when we see them in the North Atlantic in our summers, that is their non-breeding season. So they're up in the North Atlantic on a big loop migration. They often come up the east coast of the States, and then have this sort of loop migration where they come across the North Atlantic. Some of the birds typically have been tracked and will return south down the mid-Atlantic. But then again, especially in more recent years, we've seen bigger numbers coming across into the East Atlantic. So again, like with Cories, pre-2017, so from 2000 up to then, numbers would peak and trough. So, peak year there was 557 birds in a year. Some years, less than 20 individuals would be recorded in the year, with an average of maybe about 100 records a year. And that's only over 100 were recorded in 4 years since 2000 up to 2017. So a bird that could be expected, but we never saw in massive numbers. And again, like with Cories, in 2017 and into 2018, those were record-breaking years for great shearwater. We had 1,900 in 2017, and then a real big leap into 2018 with 8,000 recorded that year, with a big peak day count of 2,400 birds associating with feeding frenzies, again, with these tuna coming back into our waters. And again, like with Cories, around that 2022 to 2024 period, we had a massive shift again with great shearwaters, with 10,000 recorded in 2022, 10,500 recorded in 2023, and then a real big peak last year with over 15,000 estimated over the course of the 2024 period, with peak day counts up into the thousands. And again, with these birds, even though they would typically stay longer than Cories into October, November, we were still seeing bigger numbers than previously, staying later into the year. And then the next species is Wilson storm petrel, which again is a southern hemisphere breeder. These are Antarctic breeders, so they'll breed down. There's a couple of populations of 2 different subspecies breeding in the South Atlantic or the southern oceans. There's a population on the Antarctic continent itself, and then there's other populations in some of the subantarctic islands. And again, when we have them coming up into the North Atlantic in our summers, that's their sort of non-breeding season, their wintering grounds up in the North Atlantic, and they also, like with great shearwaters, take this big loop migration around the North Atlantic. So this is a species back in the 80s, 90s was considered mythical in British waters. But as more and more pelagic trips started going out into the late 1990s and early 2000s, they were being picked up more regularly. And you can see there pre-2017, with more effort out at sea on these pelagic trips, numbers were annual totals, about peak annual total there of 66 birds in a year, peak day counts of 8 birds in a year in that period. But as well as those okay average years for them, there were lots of lean years as well, where single figures of these birds were being picked up at sea. 10, less than 10. I think one year there was 4 records all year off Scilly, so they were prone to quieter periods. And again, 2017, as we saw with the previous 2 species, a big leap in and a record year for the number of Wilsons recorded off Scilly, with 115 that year and a peak record day count of 20 birds. So again, a real shift with that change locally in our waters. And then, so from 2021 to 2022, we had a couple more sort of record or near record years there. So again, a steady increase in numbers over those years. And then in 2023, again, as we saw with Cories shearwater, a big influx over that period. And we recorded 196 birds in total that year, with a peak record day count of 39, which again was unimaginable at the time. 2024, it continued even further. I'm sorry, I've got a barking dog. Sorry. And then in 2024, again, unimaginable numbers arriving in our waters, with 401 recorded over the course of the year, with a massive peak day count of 105 over a 7-hour pelagic in early August. So a huge increase in numbers of Wilsons turning up that year. So now, as well as those those regular species, we saw a big increase in these passage migrants. associated with them were some rarer species that previously had very, very low numbers of records in British waters. So the first of those is Scopoles shearwater, which this is a very close relative of the Cory shearwater, but this is a Mediterranean breeder, and previous to the last couple of years, there was only 3 British records. The first of those was on Scilly in 2004 from a pelagic. The next record was in 2019 from a Scilly pelagic, and then there was a North Sea record in 2020. So really rare bird, three records prior to 2023. And then with that big influx that we experienced of Cory shearwaters, we realised early into August that there was something happening with the with Scopoles as well. A couple of Scopoles were photographed, and then as the season progressed, we more and more were being photographed both by us sort of locals on the boat and by visiting birders, and they were sending their photos through, and we soon realised that we had a big influx event going on with Scopoles, and it was estimated that we tried to figure out a percentage of the number of Cories that came close to the boat, close enough to ID, versus the number of Scopoles that were photographed. And when we kind of figured out the percentage of Cories to Scopoles in our waters at that time, it's quite possible that there was 100 plus Scopoles in the area, but possibly many, many more. We wondered if that was a one-off event, but as it happens, last year we went back out again, and sorry, I'm just going to have to close the door. Okay. Yeah, we wondered if it was going to be a one-off event, but yeah, we soon realised into the pelagic season last year that we were seeing Scopoles again, and not as many last year, but again, the numbers of Cories coming into our waters were less. So yeah, another mini influx year of Scopoles, and we're interested to see if that's going to continue into 2025. Now, another species is South Polar skua that we always predicted we were going to see at some point off pelagics on Scilly, but it hadn't happened again prior to 2023. There was only 3 British records prior to that year, and they were all of moribund birds picked up on beaches. One of those was on Scilly in 2021. The others were Dorset in 1996 and in Glamorgan in 2002, but there had never been an at-sea record of the species. And again, we saw in 2023 with this big influx of Cory shearwaters, the Scopoles arriving, and with the great shearwaters coming in from across the North Atlantic, we saw this little arrival of South Polar skuas coming through. And we had 3 individuals between July and September in 2023, all of which were photographed. And the identification of this species isn't easy, so we were very cautious. Bob Flood spent a lot of time looking at these birds to make sure we got the ID right. And yeah, we photographed 3 individuals at sea in 2023. And again, like with the reoccurrence again of Scopoles and that sort of big increase with Wilson's, we saw an increase again in 2024 with 5 South Polar skuas photographed at sea between July and October. Now, the 2 species, red-footed and brown booby, aren't we've not been seeing big influxes of these as we have with some of the other species, but they are notable occurrences. They're sort of tropical warm water species that again previously are mega rare mythical species in British waters. And there's been a slight increase in brown boobies over the last few years in British waters. There's been a couple of records in Cornwall, and there's been a couple of records again of red-footed booby turning up. But we had an amazing sort of, like I said, put there the stuff of British birding legend with a red-footed booby turning up on the Bishop Rock Lighthouse off Scilly in 2023. And for one day, it was joined by a brown booby, which sat below it on the lighthouse. So again, not species that we're seeing arriving in big numbers, but again, a significant change in movements of these warm water birds, and you know, getting these species turning up is notable. So the question is, you know, why is all this happening? Now, there's many reasons that could have many factors at play, and one of the things we have noticed is a real change in our waters. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2017, with the that change in bait fish, which we think could be quite notable, where anchovies seem to arrive in our waters and mackerel were absent. So normally around the southwest, historically, we would see big numbers of mackerel through the summer. They didn't arrive in anywhere near as big a numbers as they have done previously, and there was this big boom in anchovies. So smaller fish, which, you know, may be beneficial to some of the larger predators, like some of the great whales, which we've again seen an increase in, and bluefin tuna, obviously prefer feeding on these smaller bait fish. So we were seeing a big change in the number of these smaller fish, which resulted in big increase in tuna turning up. And from I think about 2021 onwards, we've been seeing a larger arrival of great whales into our waters, mainly humpback and fin whale. And again, we've had these seabirds associating with these big feeding frenzies that are caused by the tuna and the whales. So I think there's a lot of evidence there that the birds are staying longer because there's better feeding opportunity in our waters. So what are the contributing factors? As I said, it's hard to pin it to one particular cause. Sea temperature increases is, I think, unquestionably a likely cause, and we think we're seeing a shift of fish, a shift of these food items, where species that normally have a more southern range are moving north into our waters, and species that, like the mackerel, which we were seeing in larger numbers here historically, have pushed further north. And we're seeing as a result of that, we're seeing a bit of a range shift, not just in the sea animals, but in terms of the seabirds as well that are following the food. We've also seen a bit of a change in weather patterns now over the past couple of seasons in 2023 and 2024, when we've had these massive arrivals of birds into Selonian waters. It's been largely driven by big southwesterly winds throughout the course of the summer. So whether we'd be seeing these same numbers with other wind conditions, we're not too sure. Whether these changes in weather and sea temperature are driven by climate change, as in sort of through human effects, or if it's a bit more of a natural process with this North Atlantic oscillation system, where that sort of warming and cooling of the North Atlantic over sort of 60 to 80 year periods. And we are in a sort of a peak period of that North Atlantic oscillation currently. So those sea temperatures are going up. And for some species, I think possibly with Cory shearwater and particularly with Wilson storm petrel, could this also be reflective of population increases? Now, down on South Georgia, where Wilson storm petrel breed, there was the rat eradication project was successful there in, I think it was in 2012, 2013. And that's their main breeding colony of that population, and that the sort of subantarctic island population is on South Georgia. So the successful rat eradication is predicted there that population has increased significantly since that eradication. And are we seeing the effects of that now? As well as these other contributing factors that we've discussed, are we seeing a big population increase in that species, which is meaning more birds are coming into the North Atlantic and therefore passing through Selonian waters? So we've had a look there at the birds off Scilly and the birds that we've been seeing from the pelagics. And obviously, it'll take a bit of time. Like with any of these things, we can't make these sort of snap decisions of what's going on and try and figure it all out from 2 or 3 seasons of these increased numbers. So we're going to have to see over the next few years whether these patterns continue or if we have a drop off back to what we previously considered normality. So it'll take a bit of time to figure that out, and we'll see what the 2025 season has to offer. But something else I just want to mention that we did last year, again a little bit further offshore than the pelagics, but we went out on a expedition to the continental shelf edge. So this is still British waters, and the distance we're talking here is about 160 nautical miles to 200 nautical miles off Scilly. You can see in the map there that little red box down at the bottom there on the continental shelf edge. That is the southwestern limit or extremity of British waters. Now it's a network of sort of deep water slopes and canyons that drop off from about 200 meters on the shelf edge, and it drops off to about 4,000 meters at its deepest point out into the Biscay abyssal plain. So it's an area of potential interest that we've discussed going to for some time now. In a seabirding context, now it's quite a well-studied area in terms of oceanographic surveys and studying the seabed out there. But in terms of seabirding in the way that we do it, pelagic seabirding, it's not an area that's been studied, but we thought it had huge potential. If we just move on to the next slide. Yeah, we thought the potential was going to be huge with the potential upwellings on that shelf caused by that shelf break, causing lots of nutrients right into the surface and providing sort of feeding opportunity for cetaceans and seabirds. So after a lot of planning over a couple of years, I finally managed to pull together an expedition going out there on a sailing yacht. So we took 10 birders and 6 crew, 150 kilograms of chum. When I say chum, that's just sort of rotten fish bagged up to hang over the side of the boat, and 30 litres of fish oil. And we have those out drifting out off the boat. All these seabirds that I've just been discussing, all the tube noses, they have incredible senses of smell, and that's how they detect their food. So if we can put the chum and put the oil out off the boat, then we've got a good chance of pulling these birds in, because they follow the sense of the smell and they think there's feeding opportunity, and they'll spend time around the boat. So we had all that, we had our team, we had all our equipment, and we headed out there on a big 72-foot sailing yacht, and we spent 7 days at sea with 5 days concentrated on the continental shelf edge. So our target species out there, as well as also not knowing what we were going to find out there, but what we predicted, 2 species that we predicted we may find, are Madeiran storm petrel and Barolo shearwater. Now, both of these, again, like the Cory shearwater, are Macronesian breeders. They breed on Canary Islands, Salvagens, Madeira, and in the case of Barolo shearwater, out on the Azores as well. And again, like South Pole Skewer and Stopoles, these were and still are mega rare vagrants to British waters, or that's what they've always been considered. But we had an inkling through some data that we'll look at in a minute that in terms of coastal waters in Britain, yes, they are still a very rare species. But in this area on the continental shelf edge, are they more common? Can they be expected? And were we going to find them out there on our expedition? So here we can see some tracking data from 2021 of Madeiran storm petrel. Now, this was a bird that was tagged on the Canary Islands, and not long after it was tagged, this was a breeding adult, and not long after it was tagged, it went out on a foraging trip, and it did a big loop foraging trip around up into the North Atlantic, and then it found the continental shelf edge just southwest of Britain. And you can see there that little area that's circled on the map there is roughly our sort of study area. which we headed out to on the expedition. So we can see there that bird spent a bit of time foraging in that area before heading back south across Biscay and back down to its breeding grounds in Canaries. So we had some data there that suggested that these birds could be out there feeding. Now, this is one individual, this could be a one-off track, but from a few other observational records over the past 20, 30 years in the north of Biscay, where Madeiran storm petrels have been seen, we had a bit of an inkling that this species could be out there and could be more common than we realised. So we'd only been out there for, it was our first evening that we got to the continental shelf edge. It was a big westerly winds. It was horrible conditions. And we had about 3 hours left of light before we had to sort of pack up for the evening and get down in our bunks. We had, in that first evening, we had between 1 and 3 Madeiran storm petrels around the boat, which was incredible that we were successful so quickly on arriving out there, and it sort of gave us a real sort of boost for the week ahead at sea. I say we had 1 to 3 just from experience of these birds at sea. It's very hard to tell whether you just got one bird that keeps returning to the boat, which we have seen in the past with rare seabirds, or if it was 3 different individuals. So we're erring on the side of caution at the moment, saying it was only 1 bird in that first evening, but it could well have been 3 individuals. And then a few days later, we picked up another bird a little bit further south in the study area. That first evening, we also had 1 Barolo shearwater, followed by another 2 the following morning, and then another individual, at least one other individual. There could have been more. We had a few possible sightings later in the trip. And as well as those 2 species that we'd expected, we got very lucky with a Fayer's type petrel, which you can see photographed there. And despite the very good views of it, I say Fayer's type because this was quite an unusual individual. I won't go into the gory details of the identification at the moment, but the ID on this bird is still unresolved. And there's sort of discussion of whether it's a Desertus petrel, Cape Verde petrel, or Xenos petrel. We're still trying to figure this out, and there's a bit of research being done currently on the identification of these birds. So we'll come back to that one at some point in the future. But nonetheless, it was a superb bird that spent about 20 minutes with us around the boat. So yeah, real highlight of the trip. And as well as these rarer birds that we found out there, there was hundreds of Wilson storm petrels, Corey shearwaters, and great shearwaters as well out there, as well as around Scilly, which we'd seen around Sloanian waters all summer last year, as we've discussed. They were out there on the shelf edge as well. So yeah, the question is, what will 2025 bring? We've had 2 very I say good years. It's hard to say. They're good years in terms of observations. They've also been very enjoyable from the point of view of a seabird enthusiast. But is it a sign of negative impacts elsewhere in the ranges of these birds? It possibly is. Is this sort of shift, this warming of the North Atlantic that is possibly producing these big arrivals of these species? Is it sustainable? Is it just a peak that's going to drop off and we're going to go back to some form of normality? Or is this the new normal? And I think that's the question that it will take a few years to answer. But just a couple of fun images there of some celebratory images from the Sapphire after we've found a couple of rare birds. I think that was the red-footed booby sat on the top of the Bishop Rock Lighthouse there with us celebrating. And then that's a shot of our yacht on the right-hand side there that took us out to the shelf edge, which was on a nice day where a few of us went for a dip in the deepest part of the British waters. We were over a little canyon there that was a 4,000 metre depth. So that was the deepest part of that you could possibly swim in Britain. So it'd have been rude if we hadn't jumped in. So yeah, there we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Scott. That's fascinating. I think one of the things that we try to do in this group is document change, and this certainly feels like one of the most visible changes that we've seen over the last few years. And as you've said, it'll be very interesting to see if it continues. I think in the interest of time, Maya, if there's one question, we could probably squeeze that in. Otherwise, I don't know if there's anything in the chat. Maybe Scott could reply in the chat. Is there anything?
There's no questions, no, just
Okay.
something from Bob that perhaps Alex could,
Okay.
sorry, Scott could reply to.
Justin, you've got your hand up. Could you be very quick, please, just in the interest of time? Thanks.
Yes. Interesting about the corries, they're breeders. So I know in the Azores, they'll have chicks right from sort of mid-July right through into November, which might explain the change in the timings. And yeah, obviously you probably got quite a lot of breeders coming into provisioning chicks, which might be which is a subtle difference probably from previous years. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we also there's consideration as well that a lot of these birds could also be non-breeders. Could be first, second year birds. That especially the birds that are hanging around later in the season in these big flocks, these big rafts. They could could be non-breeding birds, and the birds that are passing through a lot quicker are possibly breeders, which will be needing to get back to feed chicks, etc. So yeah, it's hard to figure out exactly what's going on with them, but yeah, I think the birds that are hanging around for longer are likely non-breeders.
Yeah, just very quickly, Alex, if I can, just it'd be great if someone could get some do some acoustic monitoring on the sillies, on some of the Manxie colonies, set up some sound recorders, because we've got the Barolos turning up on Lundis. I know no corries have been calling off. Is it the Skellegs? So if these birds are shifting north, Scilly seems to be a great place potentially for them. And it'd be great to sort of, well, the only way you're going to pick that up is really by sound recording at night. So
yeah, it's been discussed to get some of these audio moth recording devices out there. So yeah, it was discussed early last year. We haven't got round to doing it yet, but it's definitely something we're gonna try and get off the ground in the next year or two.
Great.
yeah, it'd be interesting.
Thank you, Scott. Sorry, Justin, we're gonna have to move on just in the interest of time. So thank you very much for that, Scott. I'm now going to hand over to Mark Grantham from Cornwall Birds, who's going to tell us about the year in Cornwall. Over to you, Mark.
Cool. Thanks, Alex. I think I can be quite quick, actually, because I think most of my key points have probably already been covered by Hester and Scott, so that's quite useful. Next slide. My next slide was just literally just an overview of Cornwall for those that don't know Cornwall. So just a few sites that we'll be mentioning that people might not be familiar with. So, but we won't dwell on that. Next slide, Alex. So I think this is a slide that really is just a repeat of what Scott has just said as well. So yeah, big numbers of corries, shearwaters again, but not quite the numbers that we saw in 2023, which follows what we saw on the Scillies. But great shearwater. The exceptional counts in 2023 were surpassed yet again in 2024, with that peak count of almost 4,700 past Pendeen, right on the Land's End Peninsula, or the Penwith Peninsula, being a ridiculously high record. And again, as Scott said, an increase in Scopodes shearwaters, so 3 records from Cornwall last year, and then just those other extra rarity records, really. And I think things like pink-footed shearwater, Cape Verde shearwater, and these are species that are really difficult. That we receive these records, and pink-footed shearwater potentially a first for Cornwall, and Cape Verde shearwater potentially a first for the UK. But these come from quite experienced observers, but we probably will never see descriptions of those birds. So essentially, those records will never really come under any scrutiny and won't make it into the official record for the county, unfortunately. And again, as Scott said, again we had records of Barolo shearwater in Cornwall as well. Next slide, Alex. And this is a species group that we don't really talk about too much in the Southwest Marine ecosystem sort of sphere, really, is divers. And but I think these are quite an important species, particularly in Cornish populations in a national and even international context. So these are just counts that I've just compiled, maximum counts over the last 5 years of the 3 diver species. And if you just click onto the next animation, Alex, you'll see. So it may not seem much, but that's 6. That is a nationally significant population of black-throated divers. So you can see that there are sites within Cornwall where, you know, that's easily surpassed in every winter. So there will be numerous sites in Cornwall, and there are SPA designations that specifically reference divers within the region. But that just highlights how important it is for us to sort of collate records of these birds as well. For Great Northern Diver, if you just click the next animation, so you see the, you know, again, not quite the significant numbers we see for black-throated diver, but 43 would be nationally significant counts, and quite interestingly, 50 would be an internationally significant count. So, you know, there are sites within Cornwall that are hovering around international significance for Great Northern Diver. So again, it's one of those species that we're keen to continue to monitor. Next slide. Another important species regionally is black-necked grebe, and this again is one that we're just totally reliant on birders just going out and checking these key sites. And you've got the Fal Estuary, and increasingly in recent years the Tamar as well. So the population in the Fal Estuary around Carrick Roads was always the most notable, and you can see there that in 2011 through to 2015, 2016, we were regularly seeing groups of over 6 or around 60 birds in the Fal Estuary. But that's, you can see how much that has crashed in recent years. And again, last year our maximum count was just 7 birds in the Fal Estuary in February, slightly beaten by the 10 that were recorded on the Tamar in December. But again, these are still very low numbers in comparison to previous years. So going on to some of the more typical seabirds, I suppose. The two key species that we do a lot of monitoring of, because we only have 2 really main breeding sites, are cormorants and great blackback gulls. So cormorants continue to do pretty well. So the Mullion Island population, if we look back 20, 25, 30 years ago, the population was 30, 40 pairs. And again, this year we're up to, well, last year, sorry, we're up to 75 pairs, which is the most that we've counted on the island. We only counted 71 so far this year, but more on that later, because where they're nesting on the island at the moment is a site that we can't view from the mainland. So we don't access the island to count nests at this time of year due to issues with possible predation of eggs or young chicks from the great blackback gulls on the island. Which takes us on to great blackback gull. And our pattern, next slide, Alex. And our pattern kind of slightly follows. Was Alex gone? Next slide, Alex. Oh, we are, sorry. I'm looking at the wrong screen. Yeah, so great blackback gull. And this is an interesting one, though. Although the lines that we can see on the graphic seem to suggest that great blackback gull is increasing on both Mullion Island and Lew Island. As Hester mentioned, that decline on the Scillies from 2022 onwards, and we've kind of seen the same thing. So numbers started dropping a little bit, or stopped increasing on Mullion Island from around 2016, and numbers on Lew Island have dropped since 2021. There were some birds testing positive for bird flu on Lew Island, so that may be causal in some of that decline. But it'll be interesting to see this year and in coming years whether that decline, particularly on Lew Island, continues or not. Next slide. So to kind of Hester spoke briefly. Again, I don't need to say anything because Hester said it already. So we're doing some camera monitoring as well, but ours didn't involve kilograms of scaffolding. Ours was a wooden crate and a bunch of rocks that we managed to take over on a kayak. So not quite the same level as they were doing on the Scillies. We had all sorts of difficulties with this. It was a cheaper version, and the upshot is it didn't survive the weather on the island, unfortunately. Just next click, Alex. But we did get some interesting birds. So it was working for a while, and we'll show you some of the records that we got from it. But Little Egret was one of those unusual birds that just popped up on the camera, and we'd have no idea that Little Egret would ever have been recorded on Mullion Island. But there we go. Next slide. But we initially put it out there because we were aware that we were ringing large numbers of cormorants, ringing and colouring in large numbers of cormorants on Mullion Island, but we never actually managed to read any rings on the island, because as soon as you approach the island, all the adult cormorants would leave. So we were keen to just have some camera monitoring just to try and read some colourings on our birds, and it was successful. So TAU here was the first bird that we saw. Literally on the first evening we had the camera on the island, this bird popped up. And that was a bird that we'd ringed as a chick, but hadn't been seen for 4 years. So yeah, so there are real benefits to this kind of camera monitoring. Next slide. And equally, lesser blackback gulls. Is this a video, Alex? Does this play? I can't remember if this is a video or... Yes, it is. Yeah, there you go. So this is a camera that we control remotely. So it's a zoom camera. So the bottom you can see is the view that we have from the camera, and then the top is when we can zoom in. So it has a 35 times zoom on it. So basically, it just needs us to keep an eye on birds on the island, and we just get various people logging in and then seeing if there are any birds to record. Our salutary warning for this camera, though, is it had various lights on it, which we'd ensured in all the settings that that they wouldn't actually shine, because obviously there were issues with that. But those settings seem to, so not only did the weather finally sort of strike the last nail in the coffin of the camera, but it messed with the settings as well. So about 11 o'clock one night, which happened to be my birthday, the camera absolutely inexplicably started flashing lights, and I'd missed a couple of calls from an unknown number on my phone, which was actually the Mullion Harbour Master asking if it was likely to be our camera. But because he couldn't get hold of me, Lizard Lifeboat was launched, and Lizard Lifeboat spent an hour searching Mullion Island looking for anyone in distress before Falmouth Coast Guard managed to get hold of me just after midnight, and I could inform them that this was our camera that was flashing. So that was all a bit embarrassing. So we had to go out the next day and bring the camera back in. So we managed to solve the problem of the lights, but then by the time it went back out, it only survived a couple more weeks, and then the weather totally finished it off. So if anyone knows any nice sources of funding for a better camera, I'd be interested to know. Next slide. And this is just this is kind of the slide that we showed last year, which just shows the summary of how our kittiwakes have wandered around within the Treorvis and Rinsey Head kind of areas. So 2012 birds were at Rinsey, and then you can see at 2015 they moved to Treorvis, 2019 they moved to Trequeen, and after 2022 they moved to Park Tremmel Cove, or locally known as Craggy Zorn, and that continued this year, where there were very low numbers. May as well go to the next slide, Alex. So there were very low numbers of kittiwakes, both at there were like 4 birds at Rinsey, very few at Treorvis, and again the bulk of birds were at Park Tremmel Cove. And you can see here, this is a colony there, very difficult to monitor. Looking at the numbers of kittiwakes, these are the key sites, and these are apparently occupied nest sites through of the site. So what you'll see straight away is that Newquay had 0 birds again this year for the 4th year in a row, and that's likely to be the same this year. Portreath has failed again, so technically birds did come in and colonise Portreath early in the year, but they left very, very quickly. So the only really birds that settled to go on to breed were birds at Rinsey, Treorvus, and at Porthmessen on the north coast. And if you go to the next slide, though, you'll see how successful those birds were. So Porthmessen fared reasonably well, 81 fledged birds. But if you look at, out of the 300 occupied nests, that only gives a productivity of 0.3 chicks per pair. And the magic figure is about 1.2 chicks per pair for a sustainable population. As I said, Treorvus and Rinsey themselves only fledged a single bird out of 22 nests. And then Park Trammell was by far the most successful in that area with 176 chicks fledged, which gives about 1.1 chicks per pair. So you can see the huge difference between those sites, that really we only have about one sustainable population within Cornwall now. And as you can see, Portreath, I put apparently occupied nests as 0 because technically although we had over 250 adults present, they never settled, and we saw a few eggs, but as soon as those eggs were laid, they were taken by ravens. So and then the colony was abandoned. Next slide. And my next slide is really the other news that Alex reminded me of actually at the last minute was that from it's a seabird, definitely, but we saw our first breeding record of Ida in Cornwall last year, which was a female with 3 ducklings that was photographed off Spit Beach near Parr. So a very strange record. We do see summering Ida relatively regularly in recent years, but to have a breeding bird was quite exceptional. Next slide. And my next slide, I always try and think where we should be going and what we should be driving for the future. And I think this year we are planning some extra survey work with the National Trust along the North Coast, where they're keen for their staff to be doing some more intensive monitoring of those sites. So we're going out in the next week or so to liaise with them and talk about the best ways that they can help with that kind of monitoring. And I'm always keen to promote easy seabird recording, that it doesn't have to be going out to islands on boats and kayaking with cameras, that there are easy places along the coast where we can monitor shag, fulmar and herringull, and counts from those sites and some effort at nest recording, which gives us productivity monitoring, is always key. And I don't know if Alex is going to make any mention of this, but one of the key interesting pieces of information is the ongoing discussions around compensation plans from wind farm developers in the region, and what they want to contribute to, particularly to compensate for losses of auks in the North Sea and elsewhere, that they want to fund projects within the southwest that can compensate for those losses. And I think that's something that we need to get right, and I think we haven't quite at the moment. But that's all from me.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's great as ever. And I will say a little bit about offshore wind, but not much. But I suspect that will be an increasing topic in future years as we start to gear up for offshore wind coming to the Celtic Sea, as well as Mark says, for some of the compensation discussions around North Sea impacts. Probably time for one quick question, Maya. I don't know if there's anything.
Yes, there is. Are there any changes of bycatch discards and fishing that would tie into blackback gull numbers?
Yeah, I to be honest, I don't know the answer to that, and I'd imagine that I'd say not, because I think any changes in bycatch discards would have been far enough in the past that it wouldn't have driven a decline currently. I know there's some interest in looking at the kind of prey species that blackbacks are bringing back on Lew Island. So I'm not sure what's happening, what the plans are with that. But to look at, because productivity on Lew Island is quite low, as it is on Mullion Island for blackbacks. So there is a little bit more that we need to find out about, whether those that low productivity is driving population decline.
Great, thank you, Mark. Right, we'll move on to the penultimate speaker now, and apologies, we probably are going to go over our 12:30 cut-off, but hopefully people can wait a bit longer for their lunch. I'm going to hand over to Joe Parker, who is the island warden at Lundy and also looks after the bird observatory. Should warn people there are some terrestrial birds in this presentation, but don't worry, it's still interesting stuff, even though they don't eat fish. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Alex. In the interest of time, I'll rattle through any of that terrestrial stuff anyway. Just a quick reminder, Lundy rejoined the network of bird obs back in Feb 23. We're in our final year of probation, so hopefully next February at the Bird Obs Council AGM will be voted in as a fully fledged bird obs. Next slide, please, Alex. That involves doing a daily census. You can just see our little map there covering about a quarter of the island. So I've just done that this morning, zipped around. I've got a big apology for Scott, actually. I nipped out the desk for a minute just to twitch the island's second white stork that was flying over the church. Last record was back in 1992, so I missed a bit of your great shearwater chat, but I'm sure I'll get that on the recording. We had a bumper year, 169 species recorded, which was the highest record for the island, all thanks to the increased coverage that the census and reputation of the obs is developing. If you move on for me, please. Next slide, Alex. We'll rattle through these real quick highlights. A nice little example in the holiday logbooks there, a little watercolor taking people out dazzling, quarter wheat here in the hand. Then the next two slides we can zip past super quick. Some nice rarities there. Pallas's warbler, second pallid swift there. Next slide, please, Alex. Other scarcities. The next one I want to dwell on, next slide, actually, please, Alex. Some notable influxes. Excellent snow bunting count. We had a bonker roost of 42 birds in the southwest of the island on the 2nd of November, and actually Corey shearwater tying in with their notable counts off Scillies, out coastal counts. We had a bumper 24-hour influx. We had 72 birds over the 17th and 18th of October. Not November, sorry, tying in with this bumper feeding. We'd only had the second record for the island back in 2023. Really interesting to hear how that's tying in with tuna feeding frenzies. Next slide, please, Alex. One noticeable terrestrial thing I wanted to pick up on was the national colouring of yellow-browed warblers moving between sites. So Hester, we had one of our yellow-broweds head over to you on the Isles of Scilly 11 days after tagging last autumn. Next slide, please, Alex. Some ringing records, mixture of misnetting, dazzling. The next slide, though, we'll start touching on the seabird stuff. Much like the, back a slide, please, Alex. Much like the gull declines that everyone's been talking about, we want to get to the bottom of what's happening to our Laris gulls. So I've got 1,000 colourings sitting on my desk, ready to deploy this season on great blackback, herring, and lesser blackback gulls. So try and find out what is the cause. Bird flu is obviously a bit of a risk at the moment. We've not had any confirmed cases since 2023, but plenty of swab kits ready to go should we have any carcasses. Next slide, please, Alex. Our shearwaters are doing incredibly well. Lundy has 95% of England's breeding shearwaters. We had a bumper year in terms of ringing effort last year, handling over 1,000 different birds. Our next full island census is due in about 3 years' time. And next slide, please, Alex. Our nest boxes, we've got some artificial boxes. You can see on the left-hand side of the picture there. Occupancy is increasing by the year. We had 10 chicks fledge out of the 30 boxes. We'll be at a stage to hopefully run a RAS this year, having enough adults coming back. We'll be working with Mark Bolton and in this case, Tim Guilford, satellite tagging some of our adults, looking at their foraging data in more depth. Next slide, please, Alex. We're going to do very similar work with our storm petrels. You can see a windy day here at the north end, just installing some of the new boxes alongside Mark Bolton. Again, we'll sat tag some of these birds just to understand what's going on, where they're foraging. These boxes went in late last autumn, so it'll be interesting even just seeing what the uptake is this season. The RSPB playback survey last year found 161 apparently occupied burrow sites. I think we're closer to 1,000 pairs, but as I'm sure most of you know, trying to get an accurate survey on a nocturnal species such as storm petrel can be quite a challenge. We can gloss over the next couple of slides, Alex. Boring terrestrial stuff. Look, a yellow wagtail that bred. The females are blue-headed. Very nice record. Wheatie is doing really well off the back of the rat eradication on the island. Next slide. Let's keep us on track with seabirds, Alex. We run productivity studies for most of our auks. So next slide, we'll look at guillemot. Bit of a middling year. Poor weather for us really knackered a lot of the breeding. Productivity last year sat about 0.65. We've got one productivity site we visit. It was very much the cold and wet weather that hit our breeding birds hard. Next slide, Alex. Puffins, although the population was increasing, we're sitting at about 2,000 individuals now. We didn't have a particularly successful breeding season. Quite why we're seeing that, not 100% sure. Is that food availability? Chicks not fledging? Do we need to look into other survey methods? Maybe trail cameras could be valuable. I'd be interested in trying a bit of colouring as well, just to see what the adult survival is like. Kittiwakes next, please, Alex. After a positive season in 2023, where we just about hit a sustainable productivity rate, that pretty much halved this season. And again, down to weather, just absolutely cold, wet, chicks getting to about 21 days old and then just dying in the nest. Also coincided with when the guillemots were fledging, so perhaps predators like peregrine were running out of auks and then started nobbling the already struggling kittiwakes. Next slide, please, Alex. Fulmar, again, a slight increase in productivity there in the graph. However, I think that's masked by the fact that actually the number of apparently occupied sites is decreasing. Over the years, Gannett's Rock, our study site, is just getting quieter and quieter. So the reliability of that data is actually getting quite slight now, and probably early season, we're missing a few apparently occupied sites that are not being captured by the current survey. Sorry, I really rushed that in an attempt to try and stay on track with my timeline as well. A couple of slides I wanted to present from Paul St. Pierre, representing RSPB. So he delivers the population census counts alongside the island. Next slide, please. Really positive news overall over the last 50 years, counting the island's seabirds. Last year we did a partial count, so only visiting Jenny's Cove with a smaller team. Jenny's Cove is the really important bay halfway up the island on the west coast. It contains 50% of our breeding auks, so we found it was still a very valuable exercise to count 50% of our breeding puffins, guillemots, razorbills off the back of concerns around bird flu, and we actually found massive increases across most of the species. Next slide, please, and we can explore those numbers slightly. Guillemot had increased 9% on the previous year, razorbill 22%, puffin 8%, and kittiwake 36%, all off the back of population changes from the full island census we'd conducted in 2023. The negative was Fulmar, which was in line with the national picture, as Paul mentions there. We've got a full island census taking place at the end of May this season, which will take into account puffins, guillemots, razors, kittiwakes, shag, similar sort of problems that Hester's experiencing with boulder nesting birds. Trying to get a representative and survey method that does not disturb breeding birds can be quite a challenge. Good news, bird flu does not seem to be nobbling birds here on Lundy. Populations are increasing, although some of the productivity counts are less than ideal. Bottom line. Next slide, please, Alex. In terms of searching for storm petrels, I mentioned briefly earlier, and the use of playback detected 161 apparently occupied sites. Habitat makes this a nigh on impossible task to actually access all of the suitable habitat, and the use of thermal images has been invaluable in discovering new colonies, and we'll do a full island survey back in a couple of years' time in 2027. I'm sorry I rattled through that, but I was trying to keep on time.
That was super quick. Thank you, Joe. And we have got up a bit of time. That's fantastic. But I think we got the main messages across, and we'll definitely allow more time next year to hearing about the rarities that you're seeing, and the work that you're doing at the odds.
Yeah, thank you, Alex.
And probably the first Twitch we've ever had on a Southwest Marine call. So
yeah, excellent. Hey.
Is there one quick question, Maya, in the chat at all, or?
No, there's not. No.
Okay, I will probably keep us going then, just for the last 5 or 10 minutes to cover the remainder of Devon and into Dorset, which I am going to quickly run us through. So as well as Lundy, we've got a few sites on the south coast that are monitored fairly regularly at Strait Point, just near Exmouth, where I live, and Berry Head, as well as a couple of smaller coastal stretches along the South Devon coast. We didn't have any data this year from the other, or from the rocks rather, in Tor Bay, so that's all Stone and Thatcher Rock, or Butter Cove, or up on the West Exmoor coast. But if anyone knows of any data that were collected, please do let us know so we can add those to the trends. So I'll start with Strait Point. This is a kittiwake colony that myself and Ruth Porter have now monitored for the last 8 years, and as others have said, it was a kind of okay-ish year for kittiwakes. It's actually the 5th highest count since 2000 at this site, but as you can see, it's not at the levels it was 4 or 5 years ago when we were up around 250 pairs. It does look like there was a slight bounce back from 2023 when there were probably bird flu impacts on that colony. So we were down to 157, back up to 172. So kind of okay, but productivity was actually improved compared to recent times. So as you can see from this plot, when we started back in 2018, we were getting good productivity 2 years in a row, then it all fell off a cliff, and it's just been declining ever since. But last year was the first year in that run of 5 years where we've seen it start to recover a little bit, although it's still nowhere near the level as others have said that is needed for a sustainable colony. What we think is happening at this colony is that we are suffering predation, probably from ravens, maybe from other birds as well. One half of the colony, if I just skip back to the previous slide, this left-hand end of the colony, the ledges are quite wide, they're quite exposed, so it's quite easy for predators to be able to hop about amongst the ledges and take the eggs. So we haven't seen any chicks at this end of the colony for a long time, whereas further along at the right of the colony, the ledges are much narrower and with often in fissures, so they've got overhangs that make it more difficult for predators to access. So it's a bit unclear why in the first couple of years we monitored the left-hand end of the colony did well, but it certainly doesn't now. Moving around the coast to Berry Head, so there's a guillemot colony at Berry Head, and we've had a real data clean on this species because I know there were some issues with some of the data we had for Berry Head guillemots previously, and that's been quite interesting because effectively what it shows is that it's generally really stable. So we had 931 individuals counted last year. They're not counted as nests because you can't actually see, there's no discernible nest. They just have an egg between their legs. As you can see, very consistent with the previous year. In fact, the past sort of 5 to 10 years, really, the numbers have been around the 900 mark, sometimes going up to 1,000, but generally things seem pretty stable. Interestingly, it doesn't seem to be increasing as guillemot is on places like Lundy. So it could either be space limited or there could be some other limitation on that population, but that is a bit different from other sites in England where guillemot are increasing. The small sites at Bolt Tail and Sawmill Cove isn't too much to say about them. There's a few shags still clinging on along that coastline, and at Sawmill Cove, numbers are very consistent. So 16 pairs in 2024, which is exactly the same as we had in 2023. But at Bolt Tail, numbers were about half of that previously, so reducing from 14 to 7. We'll have to see whether that is part of a trend or whether that was just a blip. Okay, so that is it for Devon. Not a lot of data received for Devon in 2024, but a bit more for Dorset. So this is on behalf of Chris Goding, who's at RSPB, and it covers these 5 sites in Dorset. So we've got Brownsea Island and Poole Harbour, the Purbeck Cliffs, the RSPB site at Lodmore, Chesil Beach, and then the Tern Colony at Abbotsbury. So starting with Brownsea, there were 213 pairs of sandwich tern at Brownsea in 2024. And that compares pretty well with the previous year. So in 2023, there were 152 pairs. And actually that colony failed in 2023 because of avian influenza. They only managed 0.17 chicks per pair. So both the numbers of pairs have bounced back and the productivity has bounced back to now 0.83 chicks per pair in 2024. And you can see from this longer running plot that 2024 was actually a pretty decent year in terms of the numbers of sandwich tern which bred. Common tern is not quite as good on Brownsea Island. So in 2023, they're very badly hit by avian influenza, not just at Brownsea, but in a lot of colonies across the country. So numbers have reduced from 158 to 94 pairs in 2024, and breeding productivity has declined again despite the avian influenza impacts in 2023, so down to just 0.2 chicks per pair. It could be a hangover from avian influenza, as you'll see from some of the other Dorset sites show a similar pattern, but there is also some site-specific great blackback gull predation that takes place within Brownsea Island. So it seems like possibly a combination of impacts depressing the common tern population there in 2024. Elsewhere in Poole Harbour, we have these kind of low-lying islands that are nested on by black-headed gulls and med gulls. In 2024, numbers were a bit down, it's safe to say, over the last 5 years. There seems to be a bit of a declining trend in the black-headed gull population there. There was previously licensed egg removal from those islands to service the London restaurant trade. Those licenses are no longer operational. So it may be that in time, as birds start to return to breed to those islands, productivity might increase and we might start to see those numbers go back up. But presently they seem to be declining, and interestingly, likewise, there are about 100 fewer med gull pairs nesting in 2024. On to Lodmore and Abbotsbury. So both of these have common terns and black-headed gulls nesting in them. It was a similar pattern to Brownsea with common terns, certainly at Lodmore. So you can see on this plot here, this is common tern pairs over time. It drops off a cliff in 2024. Again, they were badly impacted by avian influenza in 2023. Only 1 chick fledged from the 60 odd pairs at Lodmore in 2023, and now we're down to 15 pairs, although productivity was better as it was at Abbotsbury. But Abbotsbury numbers were down too. So normally there's about 100 pairs of common tern at Abbotsbury, and that was down to 40. So in both cases, numbers of pairs down, but productivity back up a bit. Black-headed gulls were doing okay, smallish populations, but pretty productive. And actually at Abbotsbury in 2023, black-headed gull productivity was virtually 0, only 2 chicks fledged. And in 2024, you can see it's bounced right back to just over 1.5 chicks per pair, which is pretty good. And then the kind of star of the show, I guess, for Dorset is Chesil Beach and the little tern population that breeds there. I think it's the only little tern population between about Sussex and Wales, I think. So it's regionally very important. It's a special protection area. And as you can see from the plot, things started to go really badly wrong in the first part of the 2000s, to the extent where it was feared the colony might be lost completely. But then thanks to the efforts of RSPB and a really fantastic team of volunteers there who watched the colony 24/7, you can see that it has started to pick up and seems to be at something of a recent high. And that's not the only good news. It was the third year in a row that productivity at the site has been above 0.7 chicks per pair, which I think is the level it needs to achieve some sort of stability. So both productivity is doing well and the numbers of terns breeding there seem to be at a good level, which is really good to see, and hopefully that will continue. The Purbeck Cliffs are another regionally important site in Dorset, and we've got great data that Footprint Ecology collect every year, which adds to a trend dating back to the 60s, which is quite unusual for the Southwest in particular, but in general in England actually for seabird monitoring. And what we can see is that guillemot numbers and razorbill numbers are on a general increase. They had a bit of a dip in 2023, could have been HPAI, but certainly coming back up again now. But they're not at the level they were. So there are records, for example, of guillemots from the 30s where there were 2,500 to 3,500 pairs, individuals on those cliffs, and we're about half that level. So some good news, but we have to contextualize it, I guess. However, the other species nesting at this site are generally not doing well. So you can see kittiwake started at a bit of a peak back in the 80s and have been on a very steep decline, almost to nothing these days, just sort of clinging on a bit really with a handful of pairs. Herring gull, which is the sort of brown trend, they've had a recent decline. They're more or less stable now at around 50 pairs, but generally reduced over time. And the poor old puffins, there's 3 pairs of puffins tried to breed at the Purbeck Cliffs in 2024. It's likely they didn't breed. There was no evidence of carrying fish back to the colony. So it seems like that year was a failure, but hope springs eternal. So that's the end of the roundup for Devon and Dorset. I would just do our usual encouragement of people to look at the Seabird Monitoring Programme database. If you're out collecting any data, this is the place to put it. This is where we get all of our trend information from. It's run by BTO, and the good thing is you can see which sites in the Southwest might need counters. So that point Mark was making earlier about, you don't always need a boat to get out on the water. Some of the coastal stretches you can do from Southwest Coast Path, and all data is valuable. So do have a look at that site. I just want to finish with a bit of information about 2 projects relating to offshore wind that are funded by the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme, which is a Crown Estate funded programme. I'm involved with these through my professional work with Natural England. We have 2 projects, one called Rescue on the right, which is reducing seabird collisions using evidence. This is about trying to understand flight heights of seabirds and measurement of flight heights in a very accurate way. Mark and I were involved in some trials of some methods, including airborne LiDAR, GPS tags, and laser rangefinders down at Prydanig Airfield in Cornwall last summer. If you're interested in that, it was presented by the BTO recently at a conference called SCOTMER, so that's SCOTMER, which is the Scottish Government's Marine Directorate Research webinar. So if you Google SCOTMER ornithology, you can see the BTO presentation on that work. And I'll just say a little bit more about the project on the left, which is known as Poseidon. It's a risk mapping project designed to model highly mobile species and benthic habitats across the UK, which obviously includes the Southwest. And we've collected some data in almost exactly the same area as Scott was showing us earlier. So we don't get the same resolution of data that Scott and his colleagues will get on the boat, but we do this from an aircraft. So we can cover a wide area very quickly, and we take imagery which is used to identify the birds that are on and in the water. And we've got 8 sets of data for this Celtic Sea area shown in red. And that's across the last 3 years. There's 1 per season effectively. And all of those data are freely available. You can go to the Crown Estates Marine Data Exchange, just put in Poseidon into the search bar, and it should bring up all of the data sets for the Celtic Sea and the other areas that we've collected data. What you'll see, it's a bit low res image, sorry, but you'll see dots like this. So these are observations of birds that have been made within the surveys. The yellow lines that you can just about see are the aircraft tracks, and the dots are all individual observations. We also have this for marine mammals. That's a kittiwake example, so you can see a bit of a cluster around these two transects in the middle. And what we'll be doing in Poseidon is trying to work out why it is that we see kittiwakes here, linking that to environmental conditions, and then making predictions about distribution within the gaps. And we'll be doing that for about 25 seabird species, 5 cetaceans, and as I said, also benthic habitats. And that will all be launched later in 2025, freely available through the Crown Estates Marine Data Exchange. So do look out for that. No doubt we'll come back to offshore wind in future years, as this year we're expecting the lease areas for floating wind in the Celtic Sea to be announced, which will be the first steps towards the first large-scale offshore wind farms in our waters. Thanks very much, everybody, for hanging on. Sorry we overran. We will be starting work on the annual report, which brings together all of the information that you've heard today later this year. If you have any useful seabird or marine or coastal bird observation that you want to feed in, by all means get in touch with me. My email address is there, and we will think about that and incorporate that into the report wherever possible. So thanks again to all the speakers for giving their time. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to the MBA for hosting, and I'll close the webinar there. Thank you very much.